We are going to be joining another permaculture design course by Mike Hogue of Transformative Adventures. It's already in progress. I got home late because of capitalist realism, because of my work. But tonight's course is on aesthetics. As always, this is a live course that we are sitting in on. So if you have any questions for Mike about anything that's going on, don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and I will relay your question to Mike. All right, let's check it out.
We're communicating to the people to be a very important part of their program. And of course, I love to talk about Vivian Westwood and punk as another aesthetic that was a rejection of conspicuous consumption. It was all about DIY culture. Vivian Westwood is a huge figure in creating the aesthetic of punk rock. She basically, outfitted the Sex Pistols, for example, and her shop, Sex in London, became a major hangout for the early punk rock movement. And a lot of the clothes were things that were screen printed DIY and then adapted DIY as well. So it was a very DIY aesthetic. It was a very much about what we could create together without big powers and all that. By the way, I'd like to point out Vivian Westwood is also a gardener and has a really interesting polyculture, tropical inspired garden. I don't know that she's into permaculture per se, but she's definitely got a permaculture-esque garden. So I've tried to communicate with her a few times on Instagram. She's a climate change activist as well. So it seems like permaculture should be right up her alley. But a really cool. Just leaving a little bit of space in case someone wanted to chime in about that. Yes. So this is another thing that I like to talk about, that when we talk about aesthetics in the realm of permaculture, we're not necessarily talking about making things that look like what Home Despot wants us to look like, right? We're talking about a very different view, a revolution in aesthetics, perhaps. And I like to point out this is something that we all have a hunger for, that we all have a need for, and it's a natural instinct of us as beings on this planet. We have an idea sometimes in the permaculture movement that we should reject this whole idea of aesthetics altogether, in the same way as the varsity sweatshirt and the gray beige sofa look, but this is a fundamental thing to nature. The elk in the woods doesn't shirk its aesthetics. The elk in the woods raises its head and its shoulders and lifts itself high and has this majestic bearing, and it doesn't slink apologetically through the forest. It plants itself and says, I am a mofuggin elk and I deserve to inherit this earth. And this is the same in all of the indigenous societies that we celebrate. Again, we almost in the West have an idea that indigenous peoples reject aesthetics, because our view of aesthetics is all about conformity to Western society. But they don't reject aesthetics at all. They're like the elk. They embrace beauty and meaning in life and celebrate that, and it's part of any vibrant culture. So as we look to create a permanent, just, and sustainable society, I'd like to implore you all to think about what that looks like and how we communicate it to people. And it doesn't necessarily mean, again, that we have to look like Home Despot or that we have to put on a suit and tie, but it means that, like the elk, we can demonstrate and show that we deserve to be here on this planet. We can celebrate that and celebrate our lives. Just leaving a little bit of space in case anyone has thoughts, comments about that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
One thing is nature, and obviously because of your garden at Lily House. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But nature operates like that too. with flowers. And it seems as though one of our best friends and co-helpers are the flowers. And the thing is that the very ones that, and it's like, so I'm really fascinated by this. I want to do more in this vein, like the flowers that self-sow, have to do nothing about, are often the ones that attract the most beneficial insects. And there are, people are catching on. I mean, ever since Rachel Carson in the 50s, people are catching on to what's happening to the birds. And they, you know, she really got people's attention when everybody was asleep. I was there, I saw it. And so yeah. And then that the nature has it all figured out about attracting things to the beautiful flowers. And one of the things that's interesting, I just want to just quickly say this, because people love roses, and they have the idea that roses, they're difficult, and they get aphids, and they get funguses, blah, 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 blah. But the deal is that the old roses, those are the hybrid teas. When the commercial industry came, I don't know who brought that up, but anyway, they're the old roses. There's some, the old roses are not like that. The old roses are I have old roses all over the place, and they get a few aphids, but it's not a big deal. I don't worry about it. No, a little bit of fungus, not anything to worry about. And they smell absolutely heavenly. I mean, you can smell it for, like 10 feet away. They're just exquisite. And they spread by runners. So you can multiply them like so ridiculously easily.
Yeah.
Nature's on our side.
Another one that's good are the old Bregoza roses. And you'll notice that a lot of medieval paintings of roses look like Bregoza roses. They're a little less cultivated version of roses, but they're quite beautiful. And for people doing like small holding kind of gardens, where we want our gardens to be very multi-purpose, Regoza roses are amazing, because some of the Regoza roses tend to have the most aroma, great aromatics. The petals are edible. The Regoza alba was cultivated for a while for the quality of the leaves. I wouldn't say they're a salad crop, but they're definitely tea worthy or juiceable. And of course, the hips have the largest hips. Some of the hips are the size almost of golf balls, and you can literally eat them like little apples. You just can't bite into the center because the little hairs around the seeds will irritate your throat. But you can actually bite into the flesh of a really good Regoza rose hip, and it'll like squirt juice like an apple does. So some of those Regoza roses are definitely really worth growing as well, and very easy plants, especially in a hedgerow. The only thing to be careful of is they spread by runner, so they need to be maintained with a mowing strip of some kind usually. So I love them in hedgerow type things.
Yeah, and the roses I'm talking about hardly require any water at all. I mean, it's mind-boggling. And also, like talk about edible roses. The petals of all roses are edible, and they're just incredibly high in antioxidants. I mean, they're just like, they beat out. I mean, they're higher. It's incredible. Yeah. And it's like nobody's even noticing this.
Yeah. And I want to say what a great point. And rose hips are super high in vitamin C, and they make an amazing cider. One of the best ciders I've ever made was a rose hip cider, and it was amazing. So they're great things. And I love that you pointed out how nature communicates this sort of thing, even in its flower forms. Flowers, no flower, nothing in nature really nothing in nature is the beige sofa. Everything in nature in this way is about celebrating life and about communicating that. It's, we've evolved for that. And flowers are so interesting, and they give us an idea about our aesthetic sense. Why are flowers beautiful? Usually, when we enter, imagine you're a human, looking around the landscape, looking for a place to feel safe, looking for a place to settle with your village. What guides us is our aesthetic sense. That includes the sense of the soil, the sense of a lush, fertile ecosystem. When we see a huge diversity of flowering plants, that's a sure sign of biodiversity, which is going to improve our health, and of food security and a healthy ecosystem. So these things can communicate to us really directly in a way that beauty isn't just conformity, it's communicating to us that this is a healthy, abundant place to be. Come here, settle here, live here. And when we enter such an ecosystem, this is why when people would visit the gardens at Lily House, the blood pressure would drop and people would say that they had a religious experience in the garden because it was communicating to them, here is home. Here is a place to linger and stay for a while. And imagine what we can accomplish if we can recreate societies that have that feel to them, so that our cities and our villages and our homes are filled with that kind of abundance and food security and richness. That to me is a world of abundance and not a world of scarcity where we have to fight each other over limited resources, right? So, yeah, these are great things to talk about.
And it even applies to broader nature because the more healthy our soil gets, the more birds there are. And so they get it too. And also kind of the more cats there are, but the birds can fly. We are attracting some wild cats. But also, I'm sure there are some rodents out there that we wish weren't there. So the cats have their role to play.
There's actually great science on this now too, that it's in all animals. Like rodents that you mentioned usually have a programmed sense right in their, it's hardwired response to stay near walls. They feel comfortable and safe when they're next to walls and going into dark spaces. Their body gives them a little dose of anxiety when they're out in the open and places like that. And their body gives them some dopamine and makes them feel more relaxed when they go into places that are safer. And, we know very surely now that when animals are in ecosystems where they're going to have good access to water and food and safety, the stress response goes down, anxiety goes down, violence and conflict within those communities go down. And we see the same thing in human communities too, because we're exactly like that. Christopher Alexander in A Pattern Language says this too, that he believes that we as humans have these built-in, hardwired biological inclinations to go to these places that will feel abundant for us, beautiful places, why we like to go to them. And when we create that in our communities, guess what? All of these measures of social inequality and problems start going down. When we put trees in landscapes and urban environments, for example, guess what? Crime goes down. Educational attainment goes up. Because people are more relaxed, more easily able to focus and study. And when we take trees out of urban environments and pave them over and create, the asphalt jungle, as people call it, then crime goes up and inequality goes up and all of those, and educational attainment goes down. So these are powerful things that we're talking about when we're talking about surrounding ourselves with beauty. It's not just to be bougie and make our neighbors happy with us. We're doing something. When we create a beautiful environment for ourselves, we create an environment for ourselves to thrive and achieve and be more relaxed and be healthier. So this is to me really powerful stuff. And I think we haven't quite thought about this enough in permaculture circles before. It's an important part of design. Anyway, that's a great place to stop since it's 7:10. We're going to come back, and Zach, you can feel free to join us after this too. We're going to come back in 10 minutes, get started again at about 7:20, and we're going to move on to part 2 of this, which is going to be talking about aesthetic patterns and things that we can do to achieve these aesthetic goals that we're talking about. All right. All right, we'll be back in 10.
Recording stopped.
Hello, everybody. So I just left a message to the chat there, but this is, after all, a live class. I like to remind people of this. So if you have any questions or comments or anything you'd like Mike to address, the best way to do that is to leave a note in the chat, and I will relay it to Mike. But this is a different sort of permaculture class. You don't get this a lot in a lot of the PDCs that I've seen before. This discussion of beauty and aesthetic and how this is a really important part of creating a world that you really want to live in. You know, it's not just about the function of things. Like it's great to have a very productive garden, and that's really what's at the heart of permaculture, is to have, you know, abundance of food, fodder, fuel, fiber, and pharmacy. Those are you know, colloquially known as the 5 Fs, even though pharmacy clearly is not, but it sounds like an F. So it's like the you know, it's like the how somehow arithmetic gets thrown in with the 3 Rs. But anyway, beauty is definitely another one of those things that is really essential to have something that is worth holding on to. Think of how many places, you know, perhaps you've lived in various places throughout your life. What are the ones that really stand out to you? Is it ones that, you know, you've just had a basic set of 4 walls that were secure? And perhaps, I mean, perhaps that is the uh, the place you look back at as you know, the best place that you've lived. Perhaps other places have been much worse, haven't had security, or um, you know, had other reasons why they were not great places to live. But I wouldn't be surprised also if there have been some places that you've really loved living because of, say, the view out the window or the views in the street in front of your place. Aesthetics is what can really bridge that gap between intellectually caring about something and emotionally caring about something. And to anyone that thinks that we can solve all the world's problems just by pure reason alone and scientific method and stuff like that, they don't know what they're talking about. At some point, you have to come up with a reason why you care about a thing. You can come up with all of the literature on how climate change is real, and it is, how it is affecting everyone, which it is, and how if we don't do something to curb its effects, we're going to be in, well, literally hot water. And all those things might be true, but none of those say, and therefore you need to care about any of it. You know, you could just say, I don't care as long as I got mine and I'm comfortable. I don't care if the world burns. There's no amount of logic that can assail that sort of position and make you change your mind. You could try and appeal to future generations, but if you don't care about future generations, again, no amount of science, no stats or bar graphs or whatever is going to get you to care about something. But beauty, on the other hand, is something that can. Beauty can bridge that gap. That's why the arts are so important. That's why landscape architecture and architecture itself is very important. The buildings that people really hold on to are the ones that are in some way, evoke an aesthetic response to people. And it doesn't have to be the same in all people, but if you just view the world in pure utilitarian framing, in terms of, what gives you the greatest quantity of this or that or the other thing, that never is going to, again, that's never going to be enough to get everyone to care about it. But if you can look at a beautiful photograph and say, this is what we're going to lose if we don't get our stuff together. If you can point at some redwood trees, you can talk about how old they are, how they're some of the oldest living things on Earth, some of the largest living things that have ever existed. And you can show, frames of reference and stuff like that. And that much more than any sort of dry statistic about, how many board feet of lumber we're sacrificing by not cutting down the redwoods, or, or even in the other direction, how much water and flood mitigation a single redwood can do, which is tremendous. Your average regular old tree that you might see on a city street, maybe a couple feet in diameter, can suck up tens, hundreds of gallons of water in a single rain event. So you multiply that by hundreds or thousands of trees, and you have some pretty good guarding against flooding, not to mention all the soil they hold in place. But again, these are only important if you care about people being flooded, if you care about having a clean environment, if you care about any of it. So those facts and figures as well may not do the job. That may not get someone to care. But if you show these scenes, if you show a beautiful garden with an abundance of life happening in it, it hits you at a different level. It affects you in a different way. You can really connect with it on a way that goes beyond just the intellectual. And that's what aesthetics are all about. So I'm really happy that Mike has hit upon this theme. He wrote a book recently, which I have myself. It's called Beauty in Abundance. I should go ahead and pop that into the chat. I'll find it on my phone so I don't disrupt the stream. But it talks all about, and it's very, it itself is very beautifully illustrated. So it's got that going for it as well. All right. Google is not cooperating. Let's try that again. Beauty in Abundance by Mike Hogue. Okay. I'm not sure what his preferred site that you order it from is, so I'll just go with the Thrift Books copy. Anything's better than Amazon, which you can order it there as well. And if that's what's most convenient to you, it's better that you have the information than not. But here's Beauty in Abundance. Put a link to that. But it talks a lot in this book about the importance of aesthetics. And, if you want a place that people want to hang on to for generations, it has to connect on them on a level other than just, you know, oh, that's a place that kept me out of the rain and snow and whatnot. There has to be some other feeling to it. So there's the link for it. Not sure how well that's, oh, okay. It's a very long link. Sometimes these websites are not good at shortening their URLs to specific products, but there it is. I highly recommend it. So yeah, so we missed the first about almost, well, I guess it was really an hour, of course. How long we've been going on now? Let's see if we can figure it out. I've been going 25 minutes and it is 6:20. So yeah, we missed the first hour of the course tonight. That's okay. This is only a sneak preview anyway. We never get the full course because, you know, you got to leave something, something to entice people into the course. I totally get that. And this is what Mike does as a big part of his personal income.
Recording in progress.
Here we go. Getting back to the class.
And we're back.
Any questions
Back in
you have?
action.
Shout them out. I'll let Mike know.
How do I look here? Let me check the lights. Maybe if I switch. Is that better? Okay. All right. Yeah, let's see. Okay. Okay, there we go. All right. So, part 2, we're going to be talking about some aesthetic patterns that we can use specifically for permaculture and ecological gardens. And one of the things about this that we're getting to is the idea that there are some aesthetic styles and looks and types that will work well with an ecological landscape. Let me make sure that the slideshow is, oh, I lost it. Let me make sure that the slideshow here is presentations available in the chat. Oh, and there we go. So, you know, so there are some aesthetic paradigms that work well with permaculture and ecological landscapes, and there are others that are simply really hard to make work. You know, now I mentioned the Chicago Botanical Garden. There are actually some parts of the Botanical Garden that are pretty permaculture, but a lot of the main plantings, you know, we say permaculture makes gardening easier. We can use these tools to make easier gardens. But to be honest, there's not much permaculture can do to make the really intensive parts of the Chicago Botanical Garden easier. They're always going to take a lot of weeding, labor, and all that. Maybe we could do sheet mulch and stuff like that and make the plantings a little more resilient. But when it comes down to it, it's going to be really difficult to make an intensive kind of landscape like that ever easier, right? So that tells us that there are certain kinds of aesthetics that are going to be really good for what we want to accomplish and certain ones that won't. Now, which ones really are going to help us meet our needs? So also, there's another part of this, which is that most of us want to avoid plastics, petroleum, poison, and pollution. We know that we don't want these things in our gardens, especially if they're food gardens. We know that these things are destructive to the environment, destructive to ecosystems, and can harm our health. So that also tells us some things about aesthetics. And to me, a garden that's in a landscape that's filled with plastics and poisons and pollution can never be beautiful. A landscape that's destroying the planet can never be beautiful to me. So this tells me that we're going to find a different form of beauty, right? You know, these things. I showed you earlier kind of an alternative to that, sort of a wabi-sabi alternative to that is what we could call urbanite. Recycled concrete, we like to call urbanite. Makes it sound a little classier. So this to me is a great thing because it's taking a recycled waste product out of the waste stream and reusing it in our landscapes. A lot of people don't realize that these are incredibly carbon intensive. Now, if you already have them, don't throw them away. Sometimes I tell people this, you know, we all have to have compassion with our pre-permaculture selves, right? If you got the blocks, you use them because we're going to keep that carbon energy and that carbon in our landscapes, right? But if we can avoid buying them, we should. I have a video on doing the carbon calculations for a little local sustainable landscape park that was put in one of my communities that I lived in. And they did it, and they specifically as a sustainable park. They wanted it to be a sustainable park. And basically, you know, it's the same 5 native plants that they sell in all the books, or, you know, all the big box stores that really aren't high quality habitat plants anyway. And a gajillion of these cement blocks. So I found the exact cement block they used and how much carbon that exact cement block used. And, you know, by the way, they cut down a forest to build their sustainable park, which automatically released a gajillion pounds of carbon into the atmosphere. And the concrete industry is the 3rd largest carbon pollution industry in the world globally. So, you know, this is something that we just do because it's been trained into us by Home Despot. And we need to start cutting ourselves off from the idea that this is beautiful and this is because really what you're buying are blocks of conformity. That's what these are. They're blocks of conformity. You can buy single serving blocks of conformity so your neighbors know that you're conforming to the social norms. But they're loaded with carbon and they don't make much sense in gardens at all. They could also potentially have fly ash and things that could be unsafe to use in the garden in some cases. You know, so another thing then, what do we do after we get these? We make fortresses out of them, fortresses out of these walls, and then we line up our plants in strict battle formation, like they're, you know, like they're supposed to go to war with the weeds or something, or war with the lawn. And you know, this aesthetic, this kind of look is really difficult to ever make truly sustainable. It's just always going to require this level of order, and everything is always going to require a lot of intervention, a lot of weeding to kind of maintain it. At least this one uses relics. You know, this is another kind of fetch I have with a lot of the landscaping that's going on. This is in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and since I live there, a lot of my students have historically been in Kalamazoo. A lot of people recognize this one. This uses these big, you know, big like granite blocks, which do not exist anywhere in Michigan. What are they doing? They're trying to make Michigan look like it's like Colorado or something. And this is a very unnatural kind of thing. And what does it take to create Colorado and Michigan? A ton of fossil fuels and shipping and mining that's all unsustainable to get this aesthetic in a place where, you know, this doesn't look natural at all. It really disconnects me from any idea of nature to see, you know, a lawn made of plants that are primarily from Europe and you know, landscape plants that are not from around here and big blocks from other places. There's not a thing in this picture that's native to Michigan or, you know, natural to Michigan. And pardon me, as we talk about some of this stuff, I might be a little bit irreverent, but, you know, we don't think about what these things say aesthetically. We just go to the store and buy them because it's what we're taught to do. Joe says, I purposely learned all this in order to know the problem. It's meant for constant replacement. That's exactly what it is. the big box store approach to landscaping is all about replacing work, homeowner labor, with corporate products that they can sell over and over again. Your landscaper is not a landscaper anymore in today's America. Most landscapers are actually corporate salespeople. And yes, as Noah says, it's all a status symbol. It's all about pursuit of status in this sort of way and conformity. We need to show people a much more beautiful and true vision for what beauty can be, right? I think we can do this. I think this is our mission as permaculturists. One tool that we have is this idea we've talked about before in our soil class of terroir, which is the French word for soil. And what it really means is an aesthetic of the land. It means that, here I have my lemon again, my very last lemon. I finally come to my last lemon, my last homegrown lemon. So the terroir is about a taste of the place, the taste of the soil. So when we talk about wine and terroir, we're talking about a wine that has characteristics of the local place. And we can say the same thing for beauty. To me, terroir is beautiful because it talks about the nature of the place that we're really at. If we say that permaculturists, what we do is build connection to nature, terroir builds connection to place and community. So this, by the way, is a roundstone home. It's one of these roundstone homes up by Charlevoix, Michigan. And one of the points of them is that they're not built from imported materials. They're built from the stones found in this place. By Charlevoix had a lot of stones in the fields, so the field stone became a big thing. And they built these beautiful field stone homes up in that region. And they are a look that is truly unique and characteristic to Charlevoix. There's so few things like this in the United States because we value everything looking like Colorado and Southern California, because that's where we think rich people live. So we think if we make our landscapes look like they're Southern California, then we'll be rich too. Does that sound stupid to you? It sounds pretty stupid to me, but that seems to be the way we think. Yeah, and keep in mind right now, I'm preaching to the choir a bit, I think. And so remember, our goal is to build bridges to people. I might be bombing some bridges right now. We're looking to build bridges to people who live in those houses and get them to start connecting to their own landscapes and their own communities in a way that's more meaningful. I just always like to point this out too. As we talk to people in our communities about growing beautiful gardens, to me, as I said before, a garden that's destroying the planet can never be beautiful. So a beautiful garden has to be grown in beautiful ways too. So that always brings us back to these holistic natural management techniques of avoiding those chemicals, avoiding poisons and plastics, using deep mulches, all of these things we've been over before in this class, because a garden that's gardened in a beautiful and healthy way that improves the ecosystem, to me, is always going to be more beautiful than one that's drenched in poisons and plastics, right? Okay. So I'm going to leave a little bit of a space at that in case anyone has thoughts about anything I just said. Now we're going to start talking more about positive aesthetic patterns that are going to work better for us than the ones I just looked at. So one of the first things that we try to do is, number one on here, find overall what I call meta aesthetic patterns, overall styles that we can use for a landscape. Because in art, we could call this Gestalt, the German word Gestalt, which means the big idea, the theme. This is often what communicates an idea to people. If someone looks at a garden and it really characteristically evokes some romantic, rustic woodland plot, then that is going to look intentional to us. It's going to look like art. It's going to communicate something very clearly. If we see that and get the big idea, people are much more forgiving of things like having a few weeds in it or having a few things out of place. So we always want to speak to people of the big ideas first and communicate in big ideas, because then they're going to be a little more forgiving of things like, they might not even see that there are weeds in the landscape if the landscape looks like it communicates this idea of a rustic, beautiful place. Yeah, that looks, a funny thing here, a woods is torn down to dirt, a house is built and sold, and the resident says, how can I make this property reflect the area that I live in? This is often the way we think here. At least they're trying to make the house reflect the area that they live in. The problem then is they hire a landscaper, and the landscaper brings in blocks from half across the country or from China to accomplish that goal of make it reflect the area that you live in. So yeah, planting design patterns, aesthetic guild examples, path and garden layout patterns, and some star plants that we can use. That's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the night. And before we go any further, this is a great time to mention this one thing that we talked about earlier in the class. Most permaculture projects run into problems and have problems or fail, not because the plants don't grow. It's because they get in trouble with neighbors and communities and people involved and stakeholders. And 90% of the time, in fact, I'll say 99% of the time, the reason why is aesthetics. I think a lot of us know this. You can go into any of these permaculture groups or native plant groups or bee-friendly yard groups on Facebook, and you'll see a million people saying, I just want to have a bee-friendly yard, and I'm getting fines from the city. So here we go. A fine stopper starter pack. These are some things that people can do to make ecological edible landscapes or ecological landscapes look more attractive to the community, and hopefully stop those fines or stop from getting fines in the first place. The first thing is, again, to have some overall theme, which we're going to talk about next. Because, like I said, the overall theme communicates a lot to people. And yes, the Fine Stopper Starter Pack is also in my book, Beauty and Abundance too, and there's more details about it. Aesthetic zones, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes as well. And there's a worksheet on it in the folder. I'll make sure you have that in a minute. Polyculture plantings and veggie circles. Another big thing is formal layout and wild plantings. We're going to look at this too. That means that we can have the ease and ecology of having wild plantings, but keep it looking really formal. And I'll show you some examples. Hard and soft edges. We're going to talk about this too. That's related to formal layout and wild plantings. It's a classic permaculture pattern. A classic permaculture design is hard and soft edges. And I find it interesting because Bill Molson and Jeff Lawton talk about this a lot. But a lot of people who have taken Bill and Jeff's PDCs seem to not be quite as familiar with this. So this isn't my idea. I'm stealing it from Bill and Jeff. Color patterns are huge. We're going to talk about that. And guilds, hedges, And one last thing, repetition and unifying themes. We're about to talk about all of these concepts. So this is just a bit of a slide to give you an overall layout of the things we're going to be talking about. First, we're going to talk about the meta patterns, having a theme, having a basic idea. I'm going to give you a few examples that work really well for permaculture. And one is a classic French idea. And I like to talk about this one because in some ways, even before the cottage garden revival, the Jardin de Curé may have been the original sort of permaculture garden in some ways, in Europe at least. And the reason why, and by the way, this is also the aesthetic model that the front garden at Lily House is modeled off of. So some of the characteristics of the Jardin de Curé are that it has a color scheme, and the color scheme is blues and whites and soft pastels. It has a specific kind of form that has very formal bed layouts, right? But then wild plantings within those beds. It has color echoes repeating throughout the garden. This is a powerful impact, a powerful thing that we can do, because once you have a pattern of color repeating around the garden, people see that and they go, oh, it's a garden. Repetition of things as pattern. This right here between our ears is pattern recognition software. So if you give people a pattern, they'll immediately see the signs of human care and know that it's an intentional landscape and work of art and not just blight. All of this is about trying to fool our neighbors into thinking we're not just a bunch of lazy permaculture hippies, right? So the Jardin de Curé is really interesting because it's the curate. The curé is the curate, the minister of the Presbyterian Church in France. And in a lot of cases, in medieval Europe, in the Presbyterian Church, the curate was the most knowledgeable man, the most educated man in town, and his wife was usually the most educated woman. And together, they were part of what made a village system work. The curate was usually the head of the church, but he was also would tend people's spiritual needs, and his wife was often the main herbalist and midwife in a community, and their garden had to be a medicinal garden, and it had to supplement their income for food. It had to provide food for the church in some cases as well, and it provided fruit and flowers for the celebration. And the garden had to be a place where people could come and visit the curate and his wife to have their spiritual needs met and to sit in peace and discuss their problems with people. So this is a multi-purpose garden that had to be spiritually comforting and provide flowers and provide food and fruit and beauty all together at once. And because the curate and his wife were the two busiest people in the town, it also had to be done and maintained easily without a bunch of volunteer labor, like a modern garden, like a modern botanical garden. So to do that, the garden used these formal layouts, often like a cross. The garden at Lily House is based on an ankh, a symbol of permanence and sustainability. But the classic Jardin de Curé was based on a cross-type pattern because that has spiritual resonance for the Presbyterians. And it also invoked the formality that the curate may have seen at places like Versailles. So he would have been educated on the great gardens of Europe, but he didn't have a fleet of servants to maintain his garden. So it had to be formal layout, but half wild inside the bed. So the beds were usually polycultures of flowers and vegetables grown around fruit trees, with hedgerows, with roses. Basically, it's a permaculture garden. And it had all of these ideas too, including spiritual symbolism to tie it all together. So this is a thing too that became a big revival in the United States and in Europe in around the 1840s, 1850s, maybe through the 1860s. So a lot of historic homes in the United States may have had a Jardin de Curé inspired garden at one point. Lily House, having been built in 1840, very possibly could have had a Jardin de Curé inspired garden in its front yard before we recreated it here. And there's the Ankh upside down in this picture. It's an upside down Ankh from here, but it is visible from space. The front garden is laid out like a giant space Ankh. And you know what? When I would take people down to the bottom of the garden and look up at it, and people would see the Ankh, and I would tell the story, it had a lot of resonance for a lot of people who also felt this connection to earth spirituality from the pagan Ankh, and the idea that the Ankh represents eternalism in a way, and in that case, permanence, as in a permanent culture. By the way, here are a list of some of these Jardin de Curé appropriate plants in these pastels and blues and whites. By the way, why that color scheme? By the way, blues and whites with flashes of other colors are one of the classic garden color schemes, in part because of the Jardin de Curé. So it's a very common thing to see. But another reason why is because the blues and white colors shine at dusk and dawn. So for busy people like the curate and his wife who had busy work lives and would primarily spend their time in the garden in the dusk and in the dawn for a few hours before bed, this color scheme is the color scheme that looks most beautiful. The whites shine by the light, and the purples and blues form a kind of underglow in the garden. And so this color scheme is intended to be enjoyed at the time when busy working people will actually be in the garden. And it's also great for pollinators too, because of all these plants that are great for pollinators. So just a list of some of these types of plants that you can take a screenshot of or whatever that are great for a perennial edible garden, great guild plants that also make the backdrop or the basis for a great Jardin de Curé inspired garden. And this guild from the book is also based on this Jardin de Curé kind of color scheme too. So this is a great take and play guild that a lot of my students have now installed. Because once I explain some of the ideas behind the Jardin de Curé, a lot of people are into it, especially if they have a more formal looking home, kind of an Italian home or a Victorian home. It might have been very common for these homes at one point to have this kind of garden to it. Yes, there are other color schemes with some other types of meanings too. But this one is pretty special because of that historic significance. But there are some other common garden color schemes that we can talk about as well that look really great in different kinds of gardens. Just before we move on to the cottage garden, another type of garden that we can talk about as an aesthetic pattern. Does anyone have any other thoughts or comments, questions about this Jardin de Curé? There's an article on creating a permaculture Jardin de Curé at transformativeadventures.org. So it has more rules about how we can get that symbolism, and it can provide us, it's kind of a fun adventure, this idea of recreating that pattern of the Jardin de Curé in an edible public or home garden. Thoughts, questions? Just give them a space. Take a drink. Again, you get the idea of how these things together, the symbolic idea of the paths and the color schemes and the color echoes and spiritual symbolism and all of that comes together to make a garden that doesn't look, even with all that wildness in the beds, that garden does not look like blight to people, because it communicates some very serious ideas to people instantly. In fact, it was really common, as I've said before, for people to visit the front yard garden at Lily House and look around and say, wow, this is a beautiful garden. Where's the food garden at? Aha, this is the food garden. 200 something species, and they're practically all edible. And it's a high productivity food garden that just also happens to have these pops of color repeating throughout the garden, which makes it look like there's a lot more kinds of flowers and organization than there actually is there. So that the kind of thing, the repetition, all that can be very powerful. So the cottage garden that we talked about at the beginning of class is another great pattern. And as I said before, this kind of arose as a revival, in part because of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and ideas about rejecting conspicuous consumption and rejecting people showcasing their affluence. And in fact, one of the people who really founded the cottage garden movement was William Morris, who is also famous for basically being credited with starting the Socialist Party of England, for those who are joining from bread theory. So the cottage garden has this sort of credibility where people were really looking at how to do gardening in a way that was nature friendly and didn't require social oppression. Because honestly, before this, gardening was a hobby for really wealthy people who had fleets of servants. And for the first time, people were recognizing the inequality of that and wanting to create gardens that didn't require, fleets of servants and all that. And the model that they looked to were these classic paintings and everything of medieval type gardens in particularly in England, but really throughout Europe. You see in this all of the characteristics that we talked about as characteristics of the food forest garden and food forest. So cottage gardens are recognized as a form of food forest. They very often would have a pear tree, a Bramley apple, some other kinds of fruit trees. And just like the Jardin de Curé, they had a mix of what we might now call weeds, which were considered medicinal and edible plants. And they would have flowers for cutting and just enjoying of the garden, and vegetables and fruits, medicines, all mixed in together. So we're talking about some some cottage garden aesthetics. By the way, this is an image another edible cottage garden that's associated with Plants for a Future. So a neat little cottage garden featuring, as you can see, very dense plantings of a mix of perennial vegetables, a few specific types of things like hollyhocks were very common in them, and speedwell, and there were some characteristic plants. I see marshmallows in there to the cottage garden, but really it's all about this dense, very highly intermixed, very highly polyculture mix of beautiful flower plants and vegetables and fruit trees all together. Basically, that's a permaculture garden, right? But I mean, we can improve on this with good water design and nurse logs and all those other great permaculture things. But what we're looking at here is a great aesthetic model for a kind of home garden. And because it It has this romantic pattern. It has this thing. It's very recognizable to people. Again, people will tend to see this sort of garden and not see it so much as blight and weedy mess, and see it more at least like an intentional garden. Even if they hate it, there's no denying that that's an intentional garden. It gets a lot harder to get fines for it. I always like to mention the Japanese garden too. I have heard of quite a few attempts and ideas at making a permaculture themed Japanese garden. This is especially appropriate where there's a lot of dense shade. To be quite honest, in sunnier spaces, it will be very hard to create a classic Japanese garden aesthetic. But in places where you have a lot of shade, I've myself done little gardens in areas that were Japanese garden inspired tea house gardens that were also edible gardens. And there's patterns for both of these in the book too. In a bit, I can look up the pages unless anybody else does, but these are all in this chapter on meta patterns. And so we can even pick specific plants that will be great edible plants for a Japanese garden aesthetic. And why not? Wouldn't it be exciting to see us as a permaculture movement creating more things like beautiful, edible Japanese garden type forest gardens? Gardens that have great spiritual resonance for us, in addition to their edibility. Hey, just giving a little bit of space in case anyone else has thoughts, comments, questions on any of that. Thanks, Noah, for sharing the page on the fruit tree guild in cool colors. We'll see some more guilds with different color schemes a little bit later in the talk. Post-wild gardening is a great modern movement that's even being heralded in places like there was a whole issue of Architectural Digest on post-wild gardening. This is really great for permaculturists who are trying to get people looking at more sustainable aesthetic ideas, because we can say, hey, look, what we're doing is even in Architectural Digest. This means that bougie rich people like this stuff. It's funny, in a lot of our communities, we actually have this idea that like rich people are starting to create like meadow gardens and post-wild gardens and this kind of stuff, while people in poor communities are still expected to mow their lawns and just have lawns. To me, this is another iteration of basically environmental racism, where we have different sets of rules and different aesthetics for people who are wealthy and people who live in poor neighborhoods, right? So this can help us get through that. So post-wild gardening is a takeoff on the idea of wild gardening. The wild gardening movement was all about doing aesthetic gardens, but using native plants, right? So a lot of our ideas that are really popular in like master gardener programs are based on wild gardening aesthetics. Post-wild gardening recognizes that those are not like actual wild ecosystems. Wild ecosystems are dense and there's no spaces and there's no mulch in between them. They're really this lush profusion of plants. This is also a lot easier to maintain than a garden that has, widely spaced native plants with bare soil in between them. We all know that's really difficult to maintain. You have to do a lot of weeding. Whereas these post-wild gardens that may include non-native plants and edible plants, and they look much more like wild ecosystems. is much easier to maintain. So this paradigm of post-wild gardening is great. And I love post-wild edible gardening. On Lily House, on the transformativeadventures.org, there are a couple of articles on post-wild edible landscaping that has links to the Architectural Digest article and some books that have been written on post-wild gardening too. So again, if I'm doing organizing a community event and a community type of food forest someplace where there are going to be people who are going to be concerned about the aesthetics of it, these are the books I give to people. I look up post-wild gardening. I get people copies of that Architectural Digest. I get people those post-wild gardening books and get people thinking, this is a realistic expectation for what a permaculture garden could look like, not Chicago Botanical Garden, right? So we're already communicating a more sustainable aesthetic and one that's going to be more realistic than the home despot look. So a related style is called Dutch invasion gardens. Piet Oudolf is considered one of the main names associated with this form of gardening. By the way, this isn't a Dutch invasion garden. Kind of, I think it looks like one. It uses some of the same rules, but that's a spot in Lily House. This is a Piet Oudolf garden. And again, it looks like a beautiful wild savanna ecosystem, but then it has careful repetition of color and color scheme and softness to it and different forms all blended together. It looks in a way like an oil painting. Actually, Christina, I think that some of your garden pictures look like edible versions of Dutch invasion gardens. So I think you have very beautiful gardens. I think that they look like this in some ways. Now we can play up some of these elements too with things like the poppies you see here, and I think Monardas, one that I often recommend, is having a lot of visual impact. It's about, what do you see in this picture? What makes this work? It's the forms and the color repetitions and the subtleties that all make these sorts of gardens work. And Piet Oudolf gardens are beautiful and designed to be appreciated all season long, like wild ecosystems. So they have flowers that blossom in color schemes that work well all season long. So, and again, when I'm trying to get people to see aesthetics that could work for public permaculture projects, this is really what I'm trying to get people to see. Just highly recommend it. If you're in Chicago, there's a few people in this class are in Chicago or the Chicagoland area. There is a Piet Oudolf garden in Chicago, and it's really spectacular to go visit. So highly recommended to go take a field trip. Even, I don't know about this time of year, but even if you go visit it in November or early December, you'll still be really impressed by how beautiful the garden is. Right. And this is a thing. It's thinking about the aesthetics. I think if we create lush, beautiful, productive ecosystems, they will naturally be beautiful. People will experience them as beautiful, whether or not we're trying to design them that way. But if we're worried about getting fines from the neighbors, or we're worried about people in a project, here, Christina, when we try to do public food forest problems, I would say the #1 reason for problems, again and again and again, every place I've ever visited or talked to about this, every single time, it's always about the aesthetics of the program. That's always what people are concerned about. So being able to refine it and communicate it is a big deal to me in making those projects work, which is why I start with that and start with a discussion about what the aesthetics could be like with people, and communicating that, and communicating a vision that's realistic early on, so that people don't show up to it and if it starts to get weedy or whatever and get disappointed, because it's just the thing. It's what happens to these in the United States, at least. I know it's true in a lot of places in Europe too. One of the biggest barriers we're facing is people complaining about the aesthetics of these things. So, but you can convince people that this is beautiful, and you can pretty easily make a food forest that has that same feel. And Christina's pictures, which are in my book, by the way, Christina, in this chapter. So just to make the point, we can do that. Just giving a little bit more space around that idea in case anyone has questions, thoughts. Any Pete Udall fans who visited his gardens? That's great, Joe, that the city is actually backing stopping lawns, and it's being promoted here in all of the municipalities in Michigan and Indiana and Illinois that I've been in. That is not yet the case, and here, if you stop mowing your lawn, you are going to get fined. So I applaud you. I applaud you for having that, because that is, in my experience, super rare around here. And we need to get there. My opinion is that that we can push. We can push that by building that bridge, by making by making wild, ecologically healthy landscapes a little bit more attractive to people who are stuck in the home despot paradigm. Well, you live in some sort of hippie paradise, my friend. That's great. I'm glad to hear that we're making that kind of progress. I really do think that's great. Here's a classic permaculture idea: hard and soft edges in the garden. Yeah, I've actually had permaculture clients whose main objective was not necessarily growing food. It was that they had aesthetic gardens, and they wanted to do it in a way that was easier. And I had a client and someone in my landscape transformation program a few years ago, and her son were taking the class. And the reason why was because her gardening hobby was destroying the family. She loved her garden, and she had this huge master gardener type garden around her home, and she was very involved in that program. And whenever she wanted help in her garden, she'd ask the family for help, and everybody would disappear because nobody wanted to spend their whole weekend weeding in mom's garden. So for them, permaculture became a way she could meet her needs for having a beautiful, creative landscape in a way that was also no longer, she was spraying a lot of chemicals and using a lot of plastic. So it was more eco-friendly, and it did not require the kids in the family to be conscripted for quite as much help. And at the same time, we started getting her to plant more great edible things as beneficial human attractors, so that it actually did, the kids wanted to then help in the garden more because they knew they'd get strawberries and plums out of the deal, right? Strawberries, plums, and asparagus for helping in the garden. So permaculturing, that aesthetic garden, was a way to help everybody in that situation meet their needs better. I like to say that we as permaculture designers, a lot of cases, are like therapists for the landscape. We're like relationship counselors for the landscape. We solve relationship problems between families and their landscapes and communities and the landscapes. And this is a great tool for it, hard and soft edges. And this simply means that when we make our design for our gardens, we have some areas with hard edges, which are well trimmed, well defined, clear, right? So maybe lined, so that, like with this oregano hedging, so that they look like obvious signs of human care. Maybe even straight lines, things like this, so that it looks very intentional and aesthetic to people. Then we can also have the broader areas have soft edges, which are managed by polycultures, managed by plants, managed by fortress plants. They're wilder, as you see here on the picture on the right. So this gives us an idea of zones. In places where people are going to be seeing it first and going for a walk with you, keeping those edges hard and well-trained and neat and tidy fools everyone's eyes. Because if they show up and the first thing they see are these nice hard edges that are well weeded and everything looks tidy there, then they look up and they see the color echoes, and they will think, it'll fool the eye into thinking everything is neat and maintained that way. Haha, we know it's not. We know all 90% of the rest of it is just being half wild. But if we can make the first thing that people see these hard edges that are neat and trained, then they will accept that the whole garden is a garden, a landscape that's well managed. So it's a great trick to fool people in this way. So again, at Lily House, the hard edges here are shown in green, the main paths where people see, the place where people enter the garden, and then the rest is much more just managed by guilds and fortress plants and wildness. And having those clean, straight lines are what people, people see this and they're like, oh, this looks like a formal garden. It looks like a formal English garden. And they think it's much more tidy than it actually is. It's a great way to fool people. Again, just another view where you can see here, the oregano hedge is tidy and neat and trim most of the time. And the path and the planting after that is a wild polyculture of all sorts of edible plants. But having that neat edge of the oregano edge in front of it makes the whole thing look a lot tidier than it actually is. So that's another great tool we can use for this. Okay. Any thoughts, questions, comments about any of that? It kind of goes together with this idea of formal layout, informal plantings in the beds, right? Here, I would like to talk a little bit about some color theory. There's more in the book about this too. We don't have to make a huge study of it for gardening, but consider this an invitation to. If you want to be very serious as a garden designer, I think that this idea of starting to be a little more careful and considerate and thoughtful of color in the way that artists like Piet Oudolph are is something that will help us bring permaculture to a broader audience of people who just want to have beautiful landscapes, right? So just something to think about. Here's just some basic kind of color schemes. The most common complementary color scheme is the rose garden, red and green. So the red rose garden with a backdrop of green rose bushes and green lawn is basically a very easily recognizable kind of pattern. And again, when people see this sort of thing, it's a pattern, and this is pattern recognition software. So it makes the whole thing seem intentional. Related to that Jardin de Curé color scheme, classic sort of pastels. These soft colors and pastels always kind of look great. It's a classic kind of cottage garden look again. So yeah, I think there's, these are really Jardin de Curé colors again, but you see how good they look at night. All right, well, next we're going to talk about a few more aesthetic patterns and tools. Before we do, we're going to take a break, but before we do, I'll mention this. Some great useful show-off plants for edible ornamental permaculture landscapes. These are plants that are very charismatic, that have a lot of color, that have a lot of character, and they can be used in a lot of cases in a lot of quantity. So they make a great backdrop or a great set of plants for a beautiful permaculture garden. Monardas, obviously, I love them. They're very charismatic. They have a lot of color. Turkish Rocket is a big bomb of yellow color on here. Cone flowers are great. Any of the white umbral type plants used in different layers. So I love to have a garden that layers like yarrow and carrot flowers, and then up on another layer, valerian and skirret umbrals, and then on a third layer up high, things like elderberry flowers. So we have a repetition again of this white umbral look at multiple layers. I've used this in a lot of my gardens, and it makes a big visual impact. And people see it, they see that repetition. And again, repetition is pattern. It communicates this is intentional. It's not blight. Even though if you look at those leaf or flower patterns separately, most people would see carrot flowers and yarrow and elderberry as weed flowers. But if you repeat them in that kind of way, then it looks intentional and they no longer look like weeds to people. Chives are obviously great. I love chives in my garden. Do you know cram? I talk a lot about sea kale. Cram cordifolia is, heartleaf cram is sea kale's bigger, uglier relative. It's less edible, but you still can't eat it. It's not quite as tasty, but the flower buds are still edible. But it grows enormous. It will flower a massive flower head as tall as me, and it looks like sea kale flowers. So really beautiful, huge, high impact plant. But all of these here are things that that make a huge impact in the landscape. Boy, artichokes are just gorgeous in the landscape, as is cardoon. It is a bit hard to find in the US. I have received it. I've gotten it from Digging Dog Nursery. Is that where you found it? Oh, yep, that's where you said you found it too. Yeah, so that's the only place I've gotten it, was Digging Dog Nursery. I used to sell it in small amounts at Lily House too. So, hey, look at that. We talk about opportunities. Grow cram. Be your local cram supplier. Make $1 million off that heartleaf cordifolia. Yeah, this is, of course, sea kale, a beautiful, amazing vegetable. And what a gorgeous leaf color and a stunning plant in the garden, especially with these kind of Jardin de Curé and soft colors. Just another look at those colors at the front garden at Lily House. with repetition of form, repetition of color, the color echoes and a color pattern, all of it together. You know, without those things, people would probably see this garden as a big weedy mess. But because of those things, it had a visual impact to people as being an intentional, beautiful garden. Okay, it's 8:19. I'd like to take one more break. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about some things like my edible aesthetic meadow guilds and a few more aesthetic guilds that we can talk about that'll be useful to people, and that'll kind of fill us out for tonight. We'll have a little bit more discussion at the end too, in case other people have other great ideas you'd like to share about making beautiful aesthetic ecological landscapes. But let's take a break first. Let's come back in 10 again at 8:30, and we'll spend the last, say, 20 minutes talking about things. Sound good? All right, sounds good.
Recording stopped.
Okay, so covered a lot of aspects of aesthetics. Did a little bit of color theory there as well. Any questions so far? I'm not going to have too much more tonight that will be covered. Yeah, what's everyone thinking about it? How do you like the class so far? If you would like to see more of this stuff, let me put up the playlist. In fact, I'm going to save this right into the playlist right now so that it will come back whenever you look for it. But on my YouTube channel, bread_theory, or no, actually it's just bread theory. I couldn't get bread_theory for some reason. I have all the playlists for this sort of thing. And let me just pull that up in a minute. And I will send you the link to it. Hours and hours of classes with Mike. Oops. We wanted the whole playlist. I copied just one episode. But here we go. Here's the full playlist. So here we go, coming into the chat right now. You can go check that out. Give my channel a sub while you're at it. There's all sorts of things that I talk about there, and I'm pretty good with keeping up with the playlists because I do go back and forth from topic to topic. So just to make things a little bit easier, if you're coming mostly for the permaculture stuff, there's playlists for that. If you're coming mostly for new urbanism and other urban planning issues, there's playlists for that. If you like the sort of commentary about right wingers or what's going on in the news or politics or whatever, there's miscellaneous topics with a number of videos in that one. And if you like the political theory, then those are organized by book and by author. So all sorts of playlists there to check out. Any other links that anyone would like to some of the topics? It can be hard when it's just spoken to know the place to look, but I did leave a link for that. What was it? Jardin des Curés that he talks about quite a lot. So there's that. Maybe you'll find a link to gardening color theory. That might be a helpful one to have. Let's see what we can find. Let's see. So here's a nice color wheel from Proven Winners, which is a landscaping supply company. Provide a lot of potted plants. Sometimes people forget to turn off their mic when they're watching the show, so we're getting some background noise. I wonder if there's any way that I can just mute him. Apparently there's not. So anyway, here's some color theory from Proven Winners. Something to check out, mull over. I liked his point about if you have the edges of the garden looking neat and intentional, people are much more likely to accept anything that's beyond that edge as also intentional. I find that to be very true. When I put in a huge wildflower garden at my parents' house, it's now expanded beyond its borders, but okay, we're gonna pull away because someone is unaware of the noise they're making. Oh my! Oh, and they're just hacking and coughing into the. So I hope while that's off screen you can't hear it. But anyway, so where was I? That was really distracting. I apologize for that. Yeah. So if you make the edges look formalized, people are more likely to just believe that anything beyond that point is intentional. Because why would you leave just part of it intentional and part of it wild? As long as it doesn't look weedy, as long as things look like they are where they're supposed to be, then people will accept quite a lot of diversity and variety. I think there's something to be said too about just using as many colors as possible. I kind of like that you get like a wildflower seed mix and it has just a whole rainbow of colors and stuff like that. I think there's something to be said for pulling from all different aspects. Again, as long as it looks intentional, you can really make it work. Are we going back? Nope, it's just still ambient noises from participants. But yeah, I really did like that point. That's very true. Oh yeah, so my parents, I was talking about my parents' wildflower garden. I had a huge wildflower garden, and I did it by seed, so it was pretty random what came up. I mean, I knew what was in the plant list, but it was random where things got placed in relative to one another. But there was a whole range of colors and textures and sizes. And my parents at first were a little bit hesitant about it. They didn't want it to just look overgrown and weedy, so I put in a little border around it, just to it's like some of those concrete paving stones that we looked at earlier, and that made the difference. There was a clear delineation between the wildflower garden and the normal lawn, and that was good. And it gave my dad something to look at, to visually align himself with when he was mowing the lawn, because wildflowers tend to invade lawns if you let them, which I think is great. But not everybody does. Not everyone just wants their entire yard to be taken over by a wildflower garden. And that's fine. But yeah, a little touch of formality, and sometimes you can get around a lot of regulations. A house I used to live at did the same sort of thing. We had a lot of different sizes and textures and colors of mostly native flowers, and a few other ones too. There was some creeping phlox at the edge of the thing, but we made a little garden wall to contain it, and never got fined by the city for it. Never had any trouble really at all with it, just because it looked intentional. Just that little bit made it go from unkempt patch to formalized statement, more or less. Let me just listen back in, see if we're back on yet. Does not appear so. So yeah, no questions yet though. Well, that's fine. This Wednesday, we'll be continuing on with Alexander Berkman's What is Communist Anarchism? Now someone is blowing their nose. I wish someone would inform them that their mic is on. Maybe I should do that, but I don't. I think okay, here we go. Getting back to the show. Let's get back in.
Hello again. So we're coming near the last few major kind of tips and tricks for this sort of thing that I have for you tonight. One, I really wonder what, and maybe I wonder if Joe could find any information about how his local area has been so successful in pushing for this sort of acceptance for ecological landscapes when so many of our communities are completely not understanding of it. So I wonder what they're doing there. Somebody there has done some great community organizing work for getting those sorts of things passed. So I don't know if he has any info or tips for us. I got close to wrong. Of course, we can talk about that more in a couple of weeks when we start talking about community organizing and social permaculture, because that's exactly the sort of thing that we'll be talking about. And hopefully it wasn't too noisy. In Kalamazoo, and just a couple of years before I moved in, a major revolution. Someone had a native plant garden, and got the bejesus fine on them for having a very beautiful, classic wild garden of native plants. And it wasn't even like a post-wild kind of garden. It was very formal sort of native plant garden. So there, this sort of thing was all very new. And a couple of the other permaculture gardens in town were still getting fined. So one was getting fined a lot. So meanwhile, Lily House was in a much more visible location and was not getting fined. So this sort of thing all depends a bit on the local municipality. That's kind of part of our terroir, right? So, but let's see this. Avon and Gavin say we've just been invited to sit our city council sustainability council. Legalize ecological gardening sounds like a great campaign to start with. It's probably one of the best things we can do. And if you need help selling that, then the other part of it that I always like to stress is support people in ways to have more beautiful ecological gardens, in ways to meet both needs. And this ecological or this edible aesthetic meadow is one of the things that I always tell people to do. So oftentimes the very first thing that people do when they want to have a more ecological landscape is stopping mowing, which is great because it's probably the single most high impact thing you can do in the landscape to start with, right? As soon as you stop mowing, all sorts of great things start happening, including natural polyculture. The problem is, if you just stop mowing, probably in most places in America still, you start getting tickets. So that's where having like an edible aesthetic meadow guild comes in. Remember our last class talking about guilds. There are 3 kinds of guilds. Guilds designed to thrive or keep grasses out, guilds designed to thrive with grasses, and guilds designed to fail. So this is number 2. This is a type of guild that can be grown with lots of edible plants and very beautiful plants that will grow in most places, even with a lot of grasses, so long as they get regularly cut. And this particular guild is based on another famous Jardin de Curé inspired garden, which is Prince Charles's garden at Highgrove Manor, which is also one of the world's most famous organic gardens. It's the first garden of the English aristocracy that's actually an organic garden instead of a classic horticulture garden with chemicals. So Prince Charles was very interested in regenerative agriculture, regenerative gardening, and organics. And this particular edible meadow system is done organically, and it's all based on cut timing and mowing timing that allows this to really thrive. And as you can see these Jardin de Curé colors here. And one of the 2 big flowering plants you see there is a black poppy, which is a good bread seed poppy, and also medicinal, of course. And the other thing next to it is a North American native plant, Cannas, which is also an excellent edible plant. So that's Camassia, or Camassia quamash, and the best of the edible camasses. And this is a great bulb to plant. The bulbs are really good to eat, and they'll spread pretty rapidly under meadow type management. And it has that beautiful purple flower. So again, similar pattern or colors in an unmown edible meadow type garden. So here, so to set this up, the big strategic thing for creating an edible meadow that doesn't make the neighbors hate you is to start with planting of bulbs in the fall. Stephen Barstow says that Prince Charles has one of the best forest gardens in the UK. He has the largest collection of hostas in the United Kingdom. Hostas are edible, and he educated the gardeners there to that fact. I mean, Highgrove Manor has a lot of amazing things going on, including an amazing kitchen garden that's based on polyculture type designs. It's really special. We could call it a permaculture site. Steve, he's absolutely right. Prince Charles has practically one of the world's best permaculture gardens. The only thing that I can say about it is that it still relies on a lot of servant labor, on hired labor. I think these days the gardeners, they're probably paid pretty well to do that labor. So that's at least something. But for models for people like us to just do at home, Highgrove is maybe not quite so great in that sort of way, except when you're looking at things like this meadow garden, which is absolutely doable for all of us. And it's the basic meadow garden at Lily House too. So the thing that I always get people to do is, before you stop mowing the lawn, plan it out, plan the edible meadow guild this year, and then in fall or early spring, you can start growing it out this year if you want, but it really helps if in fall you do a planting of a lot of bulbs, especially daffodils and early spring bulbs, those Johnny jump ups and all of that, this camas is a great one to use because it's such a great edible. Garlic, walking onions, Allium Unifolium, as I talk about a lot, one of my favorite alternative chives. In the taste test at Lily House, Allium Unifolium was always more popular than chives or garlic chives. All of them will persist in grasses really successfully and spread in grasses so long as you're not mowing too much. So if you start with a fall planting of bulbs, the first thing that people see in the spring, the neighbors see in the spring, are flowers come up before they see unmown lawn. And already you're training those neighbors, it's a flower meadow. The first thing they see in spring is a flower meadow and not a lazy neighbor who's not mowing their dang lawn. That changes the whole paradigm. After that, we can use plants that we can sow by seed really easily into grassland, and we can start plantings of some plants that will spread really easily in the meadow, like milkweed and goldenrod. The Monardas, especially Monarda fistulosa, performs really well with infrequent mowing in a meadow type situation. So once we include some of these things, Shasta daisies do great. English daisy is a great edible and it fits in really well. Anise hyssop will persist into these very well. Turkish rocket's a great edible for it too. So all of these things, you know, it definitely can. It's not on this list simply because some people, it's notorious as sort of an invasive in some places. And I try to stay away from that simply for this list because I don't want people in the suburbs to grab something and end up making their neighbors really mad. Everything on this list is stuff that shouldn't, right? So everything on this list is not currently a noxious invasive any place that I know of. But it would be great in places where it's not problematic, absolutely. Tuberous sweet pea is another great edible as well. Evening primrose. So all of these things together make a great edible meadow gill that can be usually mowed about once or twice a year to keep the neighbors a little bit happy. And it'll continue to come back and grow in flowers over a long period of time. That once or twice a year mowing refreshes it and keeps it a meadow instead of just becoming like a lush grassland. So yeah, what else do we have here? So there you see some of the earliest bulbs in the edible meadow there. When to mow it? The key, yes, there's a specific strategy for mowing it to maintain the flowers. If you mow before the daffodils have started to die back, you'll steal the energy from things like the spring flowers and daffodils. So right when the daffodils start to get floppy and die and the daffodils have started to brown, then you can mow it and mow it pretty short. The summer annuals, the summer flowers, all have a different life cycle strategy. Their life cycle strategy is usually to survive and flower even if they've been browsed. The spring flowers have a strategy of saving up their energy through the spring, going dormant and flowering early the next season. So if you mow those, they're done. You know, they're not going to flower, and they might not flower the next year, and they might go into decline. So we want to mow right when those spring flowers start to go. Usually it's the first real hot period, usually around June 1st in a lot of the northern United States would be an approximate time, and probably in a lot of Europe as well. But that's approximate. Look for when they start to brown and you're not stealing those. And the daffodils are usually the last of them to go in that way. So if you just wait for the daffodils, it's a pretty good sign that you'll not be stealing from anything else. And then if you want to do a second cutting in the fall and mow as short as possible to imitate browse to imitate sheep browse. So you get a real nice tight mow, and that will make for a really healthy meadow that grows in flower buds. My little bulb mix for permaculture: daffodils, bulk landscape. You look for the bulk landscaper specials. You can still plant them in the spring. They're not going to do as great as if you planted them in the fall. It's possible to still do it. Grape hyacinth is edible, by the way. Variegated cannas. So camas, that Camassia quamash, look for melody. The version, I think it's called Melody. Look for melody variegated cannas. The reason why I say that is because I have had multiple people weed camas out of my garden because it looked like grasses to them. But if you get them variegated, the leaves are variegated, and then people know it's not grass. So if you ever have like volunteers in the garden and you do the variegated, also then you see it easier and you remember where the camas is at, so you can harvest it yourself. So I like the variegated camas because it gives you something pretty to look at and you can identify it easily. Some of the wild tulips like Turkistanica are really great and also edible too. And of course, we can talk about crocuses. We can talk about fall crocuses, including the saffron crocus.
Some of the domesticated tulips are also edible. They don't taste very good, but they're edible. And I don't know which ones. I don't want to mislead anybody.
Right, that's the trick. They're edible, but may not taste very good.
Green smoothie again.
Okay, what else do I have here? I think that's pretty much a lot of the stuff for tonight. There's one last term that gets thrown around a lot when we're talking about aesthetics in places like permaculture. It's biophilia. Things that show and demonstrate a love of nature patterns. I love them. You know what? They make a big visual impact. I haven't included them on any of my lists in here because they're not important as edible or ecological plants. But consider all of your favorite plants, all of your personal favorite ornamentals belong in your garden. A lot of times people feel weird about planting roses or daylilies in a garden. Daylilies are an amazing edible, by the way. Yes, thank you, Zach, for mentioning there is the white flowering death camas. It's actually been planted as an ornamental in one of the gardens where I was taking over. And so I did not plant camas there because I didn't want to die. And, the edible camas flower is blue, death camas flower is white. But I didn't want to mistake the bulbs. You have to be very careful that your camas is flowering blue and not white. Thanks for mentioning that, Zach. We don't want any death camas fatalities because of my PDC. This idea of biophilia, just showing nature patterns, can be a really powerful thing too. My book has more examples of this sort of stuff. But here's a big, I love these big leaf shapes that we're doing. This garden turned out great. This is one of my gardens I've designed and co-created with a client. And based on a big leaf pattern, I don't have updated images in this slideshow. I need to get some. And again, you see my nurse logs in there and all found and reclaimed and recycled stone again. So no purchased landscape pavers, and a beautiful leaf pattern that the client is really super happy with. And then that was planted in with a ground cover of my favorite stepping stone trio: creeping chamomile, creeping thyme, and white clover, white dwarf clover. The three together make a pretty nice edible, walkable polyculture that is at least a little bit resistant to grass encroachment too. Okay. Well, the rest of this is just talking about some more aesthetic guilds and things that we talked about in the previous class. That's pretty much what I got. A lot of these images in here, I just like to throw in because they're aesthetics that could work well with permaculture gardens and forest gardens. And I love for us to be able to share these with people and share aesthetics that can work with our goals and give people the idea that's going to be different than Home Despot, but to me, so much more beautiful and spiritually satisfying than that look is. So to me, this is the future. This is a future of landscaping. It's a little wilder, a little more beautiful, a little more natural. And as we get this right in our own landscapes and invite people over, there's the potential that we will be like Rikyū at his tea house. Think of how Rikyū created a huge aesthetic shift that then created a shift in social justice in Japan and a feeling of equality within Japan and solidarity across classes. And it was an aesthetic event that started simply communicating with people by inviting them into the space to share food, to share a sense of beauty and an experience and appreciation of beauty with other people. In just the same way as Vivian Westwood did in her shop with her own aesthetic, creating something that was DIY, that was anti-conspicuous consumption, that communicated with people directly, one at a time. If we get this right and create this beautiful vision for just and sustainable humanity in our own landscapes, and then share that with people in our communities over a cup of herbal tea and a great home cooked foraged meal, then we could possibly create the same sort of permaculture tea revolution and really create this viral change that we all talk about. So that's kind of the vision here, I guess. Maybe we can make it happen. Anyone else have any last? And some more color pattern tips, color pattern stuff. Warm color pattern. There's more about color patterns in the book too. If you want, if this is an exciting topic to you, of course, then and you're just checking this out for the first time, then of course, this book, Beauty in Abundance, is filled with different guilds by different color schemes. There's a warm color scheme guild. There are all sorts of aesthetic and path layout patterns. This is all about a path of creating edible ecological landscapes that are deeply spiritually satisfying and meet our spiritual needs as well as our needs for food and security. Because when we really look at the crisis of today, we know that it's not just a crisis of ecology and a crisis of food. It's a spiritual crisis and a crisis of meaning. And the best gardens are going to be gardens that can supply that in the same way that they supply food and healthy ecosystems, right? Well, anyone else have any great tips or comments, thoughts, questions for us?
Well, looking at the idea of making it acceptable in the community, this is going beyond it a little bit. There are one thing that has been done in a couple of places in Portland. Mark Lakeman, outside his, he's a fantastic permaculturist, and outside of his architectural office, he planted all of the parking strips with grapes and apples and just invites people to eat them. And then there's a very, very incredible eco village, Kailash eco village, where all along the sidewalk there are raspberries and edible food, and they have a little sign there that says, "You're welcome to eat anything that you can reach from the sidewalk," and people do.
That was a huge impact at Lily House too. The facing the street, and I have pictures of this. Facing the street was that mix of elderberries and umbels at different levels, and it was alternating the whites of the elderberries and red Regoza roses. And so again, it was a really intentional looking pattern. And with that, there were blackberries in that hedgerow, and there were strawberries along in the polyculture along the front. And people would stop and eat those strawberries and blackberries and elderberries all the time. In fact, one time I was out in the yard and I saw a woman foraging on my front hedgerow, and I walked up there and I said, "Oh, hi." And she went, "What?" "Oh," and she was, "I was surprised to see a person there." And she said something like, and then she looked up and she saw the house and she was like, "Oh, I didn't know that there was even a house there," because the front was just, this like this big hedgerow. And she said to me, "Did you know that these are edible?" And I said, "I know, I planted them myself." and I had a lot of experiences like that with people picking elderberries and strawberries and walking onions. And and then people would take the plants home too. So I would always send people home with these plants too. That's a great way to spread permaculture, is having those edibles out front and making it beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it happened at our house by accident, because the blackberries had really gotten quite large near the sidewalk, and I was freaking out, thinking, "Oh my God, what am I doing? All this out of control." And then I noticed, like, one of the neighbors had stopped and started eating the blackberries, and I smiled and made her feel very welcome, and it was great. It was perfect. And another thing, but maybe this really belongs in social permaculture, because there's, as far as not freaking out the neighbors, there's a pattern in Portland where there will be a neighborhood where the rents are low, and so really creative people move there, and they make it really cool, and then it becomes cool, and then everybody wants to live there, and then the prices go up, and then they started it in 3 neighborhoods. And when we were looking for a place to live, we thought, oh, we get the pattern. So look where the rents are low. I mean, look where the prices are low, and that will be the next creative flowering. And because of what's going on socially and ecologically, then that will be a wider area where permaculture will be accepted. And then it turns out that is exactly right. But it's taking more years than we thought. And I mean, this is we're considered living in a working class neighborhood. Great, that's fine with me. They're the people who keep they're the people who do the work. Hey, that's honorable in my opinion. And nobody complains. We don't have a tidy lawn. Nobody complains. I mean, people say, "Oh, it's green," and they help us. They bring us, their fallen branches. We tell them, keep them, put them in your home culture right under your apple tree, and they don't do it. They bring them to us, and we say, "Well, thank you, but keep them."
You mentioned one topic that I really want to pick up on again, which is gentrification cycles. And to me, this is another reason why why I would like us as permaculturists to cultivate an alternative aesthetic to the Home Depot look. Because the Home Depot look is frankly the look of gentrification. And as we do that, it increases, gentrification is all about conformity. And gentrification is all about making certain people feel safe in a neighborhood, right? And so that those signals of conformity are what really drive gentrification. So I'd like for, as we think about conformity versus expression in the garden, it's really worth thinking about this idea of, I think all permaculture activists also kind of have to be mindful of gentrification cycles and also be gentrification activists too. Because I would hate to think that my permaculture was kicking people, creating a lot of pressure of kicking people out of a neighborhood. So this gets to be a social permaculture issue that we also, I think, need to be activists for making sure that affordable housing is offered in our areas, and that's part of what we're doing as permaculturists. So there's a whole section on my book about gentrification, because I don't think you should write a book about garden aesthetics without talking about gentrification at all, because this is, the two things go hand in hand in a lot of ways. So I'm glad you mentioned it. By the way, one more thing here. This one is on flower form. And I want to point out one thing. Flowers, having a diversity of flower shapes adds beauty to the garden, I think. But there's one flower shape that's essential in the garden. And that is the one that you see with the Rudbeckia, the brown-eyed Susan, the classic flower shape. The reason why is I have seen this happen and had discussions with people where you can have a garden filled with big, gregarious, beautiful types of flowers, all different colors. And people will think that it's weeds. But as soon as they see this shape that looks like a flower, because in their heads, the schemata for a flower is that shape. As soon as they see that, they go, oh, it's a flower garden. I thought it was just weeds. So it's always important for us to have those things that look like sunflowers and look like flowers, because they signal to people who are not plant people that it's a flower garden and not just weeds. It's a bizarre thing, but I swear this has happened to me. Oh, by the way, the top right one, you know what that is? Oh, you can see the cactus pads. The prickly pear cactus has such beautiful flowers. On the bottom right is one of my favorites too. This is one of Ken Fern's favorite salad plants. This is peach-leaved bellflower. It's not the invasive bellflower. It looks similar, but this is one of the non-invasive bellflowers. It's the peach-leaved bellflower. This one is specifically the Christocalyx variety, and has great edible leaves that are available even in December in Michigan. It's an evergreen plant, and it tastes best in December and January. You can kick off the snow, and underneath the snow, those leaves are still there and green and edible. And the flowers, I think, are my favorite of the edible flowers, other than the alliums. The top left is that Allium Unifolium, which is just so stunning in the garden, and definitely my favorite of the edible alternative chives. Well, on that note, it's 9:02. Thanks for hanging out with me and chatting about making beautiful, abundant gardens. Yeah, no?
Where does one get peach leaf bellflower?
It's really easily grown from seed. So I would just find it's pretty available in the United States. If you can't find it, I will send you seeds, Noah. And it's great. It comes in white and blue usually, and there are some plants that will have both a mix of blue and white. And it's a great plant.
I have one last question that is actually, it's a backtrack, and you answered it two classes before, but there's like 8 days of rain coming up, and now is the time to scatter seeds. And I happen to have but I happen to be blessed. A friend was moving out of town. I happen to be blessed with like about 2 cups of fennel seeds. And so do I understand correctly that even though fennel is allelopathic, if I soak the seeds for 24 hours, that will get the allelopathy out of its system and it will behave normal. It'll let other plants grow around it. So do I understand that correctly about the fennel seeds? Because I'm going to put them all over the place because I
Yes.
love the taste.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So soak for 24 hours. Is that it?
My understanding is that's correct. By the way, in the background here, you see fennel, and it's actually bulb fennel.
Oh, this is not bulb fennel. This is not, no, this is it's the great big tall green fennel, the no bulbs.
Yep. Well, I'm glad I could answer the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else have anything else before we call it quits for the night? I hope these kinds of tips, to me, starting to think about this stuff added another layer of depth to my permaculture. It was another thing for me to play with that was very satisfying. I'll admit, 20 years ago, I had a very anti-aesthetic view of gardening. I thought like pretty gardens, like flower gardens, were so boring and and I just didn't get it at all. It took me a while to get into the idea of plants being beautiful and gardens being beautiful, other than just me eating them, you know. So this is a new thing for me, and I found it has enriched my own gardening practice to start playing around with these sorts of things. So,
and I think it's an important development for permaculture, because when it first started out, it was, you know, we were wild hippies and we weren't as diplomatic as we could be, to put it mildly. And so this is, I see this as a development of maturity and practicality and observing the mistakes that we made. And I think it's a step forward. I think it's
yeah, that sounds to me like the wine movement and the beer movement. Well, bear with me for a second. So when, for a long time, American beer and American wine was just completely flavorless, right? So when Americans discovered wine and then beer, American brewers and vintners made really bold, super flavorful, like really hoppy beers, really things that like you almost had to be like a connoisseur to enjoy them, you know? You'd be like, wow, this beer is really good. I can drink this much of it because it's so strong. It has so much hop, you know? And I love those things. But after a while, you know, they end up becoming kind of cloying. You can only drink so much of them. If you look at the European tradition where they've had great beer and wine for thousands of years, then things are much more accessible, right? They're done in a way where they're still have a lot of flavor, but they're also balanced and they're drinkable and they're accessible to people. So we as a permaculture movement may have focused for a long time on the hoppy beer version, right? We want really wild, really healthy, radically wild landscapes. And now maybe the next step is to make something that's a little more accessible to people who, you know, live in a suburb. So I agree with you. Maybe that's our next step of development.
Yeah, and I mean, Toby Hemingway talked about this, but he did not, I mean, I love him, but he did not, he would love what you're doing. He's probably up there as spirits, probably perched in your office helping you. He would love it.
Well,
he said, don't, you know, it's a flaw if it looks messy.
Right. You know, Bill Mollison said that we should view our neighbors' needs and their feedback as a design constraint. And he thought if we were making gardens that pissed off the neighbors and made the neighbors angry, then that was a design failure. That was a type 1 error to Bill Mollison. So, those guys recognize that too. And yet, generations of permaculturists have made gardens that made the neighbors angry and, and got us into trouble. So, we need to be thinking about this sort of stuff. It's about building bridges. Let's face it, we're right. We're right about having more ecological, easier, beneficial landscapes that don't have poisons and plastics. We're right about this. But telling people in the suburbs that we're right isn't a great way to convince them. So we have to build a bridge, right? All right. Well, anybody have any last thoughts? I think that's about it for tonight. We're going to come back. We're going to talk more about this. We're getting really close to our social permaculture classes in a couple of weeks. It's about sold out. The money one, we're trying to open it up to people. So if anybody else has any last people that you really think would benefit from the money class, oh my gosh, you mentioned Toby Hemingway, someone who has inspired me more than anybody else. There's someone else in the permaculture movement who has been a huge inspiration to me, and that's Larry Santoyo. And Larry Santoyo registered for my social permaculture, our social permaculture and money class coming up. So Larry Santoyo is going to be in the class. I should, instead of him paying to be in it, I should pay him as a resource to be in it. But we'll all get to be in the internet presence of one of North America's oldest and most experienced permaculturists, a student of Bill Mollison, who's done amazing things. He's going to be in this class. And so I found that out today. And so that's going to be quite a treat for us all to get to have Larry in the class. All right. Well, thanks, Noah. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And thanks, everybody. And good night. Thanks for joining.
Just trying to type a little thank you message to Mike, but he cut the class before I could. That's okay though. Wow, what a cool class. That was a lot of fun. Coming up with some different ideas for aesthetics in the garden. There's a few things that come to mind that Mike didn't really touch on that I thought maybe we'd explore a little bit for just a couple minutes here. Also, if you have any questions or comments about how the class went for you, what you liked about it, what you maybe are confused about, or just any thoughts you had about it, love to hear them. Put them up there in the chat. I was very focused on living parts of the garden, but there's a lot more that can go into a garden than just the living parts, and there's elements that can interact very much with the living parts but are not themselves living. So one thing that I tend to think of, let's go ahead and share that screen, is statuary. Now, there's tons of forms of statuary that can really also do the same thing that Mike was talking about with creating that clean edge. When you put a piece of statuary in the middle of a garden, not only is it a focal point, like, oh, look at this one. That's a really good one. Lots of points of interest. You can have your eye just kind of naturally be drawn along the landscape. But also it's just one more of those signals that says this is meant as a garden. This is not just a wild space. This is something that is intentional. And look at that. You can get different patinas. This one looks like some moss has grown into it. So it gets kind of that weathered age look, but still looks like a human has been interacting with it. So there's that aspect. And then, all sorts of religious figures or figures from throughout history. I see a lot of St. Francis stuff, a lot of Buddha heads, things like that. But then look at that. Look when that moss gets really thick and it actually becomes a part of the garden, but also shows that this is a human space as well. I think in a kind of a subliminal way, it kind of blends the natural division that we put in our minds, where we think of there's the human world and there's the natural world. We don't even have a word that describes all of it together. It's always nature and humanity. But there is no real separation. These are all artificial separations, especially when you consider time as a factor. I mean, there's so many. Let's bring that up just to emphasize a point here. Take a look at some abandoned cities. Look at this. Look how quickly nature moves back in. It was always there. It was always a part of this city. It's just that without people constantly hacking at it, it does what it always does. And that just kind of shows to me the artificial divisions that we put between ourselves and the ecological systems that we are a part of, we are dependent upon. It doesn't take that long for things to spring back up. I don't think this is a real picture, but this is a depiction of what it could look like if society broke down and a big place was abandoned. Well, there was a really good one. I believe it's in Japan. An abandoned boat. An entire island. Here it is. 102-year-old ship. This one's in Sydney. I think I saw one in Japan as well. This one's in the Sydney harbor, and it became a floating forest. Look at that. So especially when you factor in time, ooh, that's a gorgeous picture. You see that these divisions are not real. So I think that incorporating intentionally elements like that blend what is the natural world with what is thought of as the human-built world, it sends a really powerful message. And I think that's a big, important part about all of these ideas surrounding beauty in our gardens and aesthetics, is that the reasoning for it is to bridge that gap, that artificial gap that we have between the natural world and the human world, to connect us in a very visceral way to the ecosystems that we are a part of, that we can be instrumental in shaping. If you get doomer pilled enough, you start to feel that the best thing that humanity can do is just stop existing. And there's a lot of people that make arguments for that sort of thing. But I think otherwise. And I think permaculture, hey, still going on for a few minutes. Okay. You're fine. Don't worry. I think permaculture is one of the best ways to start to bridge that gap. Not only bridge that gap, but also bring us back from that brink where everything seems hopeless, and it seems like the more the humans interact with the world, the worse the world gets. But with permaculture, the opposite is true. The more you observe and interact, the more you set yourself as just another part of the ecosystem. You become a co-creator of the world that you are dependent on, and that so much life can be dependent on at the same time. When you stop thinking of it as an us and them sort of proposition, you look at a cornfield or a wheat field or any sort of grain field in particular, but most commercially produced fruits and vegetables and whatnot as well. But grain fields stand out to me in particular because what you're looking at is the articulation of the idea that man and nature are separate, that man must battle nature back again and again. We're going to set aside these entire 100,000, 10,000 acres to just have one plant, and that plant is only for us. Anything that tries to eat that plant will be murdered immediately, sometimes even before it's emerged from its egg casings or whatever. In the case of a lot of bugs or weeds, there are pre-emergents you can put down on fields that destroy plants before they even get any sort of a foothold. So the idea is that humans need to take all of this for ourselves, otherwise we'll be overrun by nature. Nature's seen as a brutal thing. We have this concept of the law of the jungle, which, when you look at any sort of ecological research, like the discipline of ecology, you find that's not really the rule as much as you might think. In fact, a lot more often, when there comes a conflict in nature, either you'll get specialists that each will then go and occupy their own niche. You see this a lot in rainforests, where you have different sort of animals that maybe at one point in their earlier evolutionary stages were competing for food with one another. They instead move to literally different levels of the forest canopy, and they feed on very specific things there. Or you have very specialized diets where you only eat one sort of fruit or something like that. That happens much more in nature than just outright law of the jungle competition sort of thing. That's all kind of nonsense, really. I mean, there is competition. Don't take that the wrong way. It's just not all there is. And there's a lot of symbiosis as well in nature. You'll see, like you ever seen a lichen? Let's look up lichen. This is a great example of symbiosis. Symbiosis in lichens is the mutually helpful symbiotic relationship of green algae and/or blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, living among the filaments of a fungus. So these are a fungus and a bacteria, two completely different kingdoms of life. Together they form a lichen. So they live as a symbiote in a lichen, and appears to be a successful way for the fungus to derive essential nutrients, as about 20% of all fungal species have acquired this mode of life. The autotrophic symbiosis occurring in lichens is a wide variety of simple photosynthetic organisms, commonly and traditionally known as algae. They are symbionts. These symbionts include both prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms. Pretty amazing. They work together. The lichen is one of the most powerful creatures on Earth, in that, given enough time, it can bring down mountains. Like, that's what it lives on. Aside from the photosynthetic stuff that it's producing, or food that it's producing, it also eats away at the rock little by little over generations, eons. It just keeps doing its thing, and it's incredibly hardy. So given enough time, a lichen can bring down a mountain. But that just shows one example of symbiosis. But symbiosis is found throughout nature. It is much more common than one might think. So again, tying it back to aesthetics, anything that can make us think of ourselves in a symbiotic relationship to nature is a good thing. So we can signal that through things like art. Statuary is art. We can even do things like, it's kind of a silly example, but you ever seen like the tree eyes that you can buy? Well, these are some really silly examples, but oh, interesting. Yeah, stuff like this. This is what I'm talking about. You buy those little things, you tack them up to the tree. It's a little bit silly, but at the same time, by kind of anthropomorphizing that tree, you have a more likelihood to really start caring about it. And that's critical. If you want humanity to survive, you have to get a lot more people to start caring a whole lot more. It's kind of like Lorax said. Let's find the exact quote because I don't want to mess that one up. There we go. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And that's the truth of whatever movement we're involved in, whether that's politics, whether that's urban planning, permaculture, whatever your passion is. If people don't care about it, it's not going to get any better. Caring is at the root of all action. People don't tend to act unless they care. Let's think about some other things, like just putting it, like, say, a bird feeder or a birdhouse. Yeah, something like this. Oh, that's going to open in a different spot. That's unfortunate. It's hard to change the tab. There we go. There's a birdhouse. It's kind of cool. Mouth is the entrance for the hole. I don't know how well this one in particular works because it makes it kind of a triangular shape. I'm not sure how much birds are actually going to use that. Here's another one that's more round, though. It's just one more piece of art that we can use to bridge that gap between humanity and the world that we are a part of, the natural world, which we are a part of, the biggest shapers of by far. Oh, look at this. This one has a nose as the birdhouse hole. Interesting. The one with the hole in the head is the birdhouse entrance. They might seem kind of silly, but I think they do serve a purpose. And to me, that's the main purpose of having beauty, is to get people to care and to blur that line between man and nature, which also is how you get people to care. All right, just a few thoughts there, wrapping up. Let's check and see if anyone has any questions. Seeing none, I guess we will go ahead and raid in to another channel. Thank you all for joining me tonight. I always like conversations about nature and caring because it gets me fired up. I really want people to care about this stuff. This is why I do it. This is why I've been doing this channel for over a year now. So I want people to care about these things. I want people to care about making the world better, thinking they can make the world a better place, and that not all hope is lost, that we have more than a fighting chance. And a big part of that is education. And a big part of that is art and getting people to care about this stuff. All right. If you like this sort of thing, you can always support me on Patreon. That's the way you can get around having to give Bezos any of your money, or Google through YouTube or Twitter or whatever, any of the places I am streaming from. If you don't want to give any of those big companies your money, instead you can support me on Patreon. They take a very small cut themselves, but I mean, they're a pretty cool independent organization that does a lot of good for a lot of artists of all sorts of types. So you don't have to feel bad about that at all. But there's my Patreon link, patreon.com/bread_theory. Of course, we saw earlier the transformativeadventures.org. That's where you can find all of Mike's stuff. He was the one who was leading the permaculture course that we look at every Monday. And then finally, just want to give one more mention to the video and streamer creator, the streamer and video creator collective that we are building on Facebook. We're carving out our little spot of Facebook, making it a bright spot, and otherwise very, Ben Shapiro's still the #1 political figure on Facebook, so that's really all you got to know. But we're fighting back by helping each other out. So we have a video, we have a live stream and video creator collective going at facebook.com/leftsignalboosttv. If you or someone you know is a creator and you'd like to be a part of it, have them send us a message or post on the pinned topic at the top of the page, and we'll get them hooked up and ready to stream from that. We already have 4 groups or 4 outfits, 4 streaming channels, whatever channels, I guess is the best way of putting it, that I'll stream to that. Myself, Bread Theory. There is the Poor Pearls Almanac. There's For We Are Many. And our newest member, The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, which had on a really cool panel recently with Ben Burgess and Anarch and a bunch of other really awesome leftists discussing left unity, kind of the antidote to the, debate bro industrial complex. That's how I'd put that. And you can always see the streams that I do on Left Signal Boost TV as well. And right now, the Poor Pearls Almanac is streaming from there. So that is going to be who we're going to raid into tonight. They do a lot of cool stuff. A lot of the same sorts of things that I do, but they're more focused on prepping for the future, for a world that might not be as kind or might not be as abundant or technologically supported as the world is today. It's not showing up in my queue, so I hope they're still on. Let's look them up. Hopefully they're still streaming at this point. Are they online? Yeah, they are live right now. Oh, I see. I see. On their Twitch channel, it is only available to subscribers. That's why it's not showing up, because I'm not subscribed to them yet. But I will still shout them out anyway. Go check out the Poor Pearls Almanac on Twitch. They do a lot of really great stuff. We'll have to find someone else to raid into then. Let's see. Yeah, we got 3 viewers. That's enough to raid. Why not? Let's see who's on tonight. Oh, Let's see. A few ones that must have just started up. Don't have many viewers yet. Those are always good targets to raid into. Let's see. And if you have any suggestions, now's the time to shout them out as well. Oops. Oh boy. This should be a fun one. It's the Radical Leftist Agenda. Go check them out as well if you're watching from someplace other than Twitch. But that is who we'll raid into. She is tearing apart Lauren Southern and Lauren Southern's thoughts on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So that'll be fun. Otherwise, have a great night. Mention once again, we're continuing on in Alexander Berkman's What is Communist Anarchism? We are going to be on, I think, chapter 21, possibly doing 22. But it's been a good time breezing right through this book. We'll get done in probably the next month, I would say. And yeah, if you want to come and learn more about what anarchism is, if you're new to it, it's a very good introductory text to the subject. Now we're really getting into the meat of what it means to be an anarchist in Berkman's estimation. So it's a fun time. So come back Wednesday around 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, and we'll have more theory. All right. See you guys all Wednesday.